Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Actually, the reason I'm here is not because of my work at Endeavour. It's more about the work that I did in Rwanda a couple of years ago, from 2000 to 2007, when I had the privilege of working with the leaders of Rwanda in terms of rethinking and transforming the Rwandan economy. And this work led me to be part of an initiative called Africa 2.0, which is basically a collective effort of a number of young African professionals, some of whom are actually in the room, who decided to come together and bring their knowledge and expertise to sort of create a voice that would be a kind of a legacy of what the new generation of Africans are demanding from the leaders. What sort of new model of development, new model of leadership is the youth of Africa asking its leaders to deliver? And the reason why it was needed, we felt it was needed, there's about 300 of us and about a dozen who are working actively on a manifesto that will be launched in mid-October this year. The reason why we felt it was needed is because in the past 10 to 15 years, there is a sentiment that Africa has progressed, but not nearly enough to drive the type of transformation that we believe the continent needs. The figures that you see are testimony of that. Between 2006 to 2008, Africa collectively, and it's a very loaded term when I say Africa collectively, because if you look at the map on the left, sometimes we forget the scale of Africa, where you can fit China, the US, and a couple of other regions within the continent. So I speak about Africa in a very modest term. Not all of Africa is uniform, but by and large, when you look at the growth of Africa between 2006 and 2008, aggregately, Africa grew at about 6.2%. 2009 is a year that we all want to forget, but Africa grew at 2.5% that year. 2009 to 2010, 4.5%. 2010 to 2011, 5.4%. These figures look interesting and encouraging compared to what we used to see in the 80s and 90s. But when you pair to those figures population growth rates on average of about 3%, it leaves only about 3% per capita income growth, which is pretty anemic if we want to drive the type of transformation that we need. So that's why we felt that there was a need for a much bolder, much more aggressive style of leadership and vision for Africa. So having said that, we looked at two sort of dimensions. The manifesto is going to look at two dimensions. One is the economic dimension, which I just spoke about. But we see a similar trend on the political dimension, meaning it's as if Africa makes 2 steps forward and 1 step back, which means that our rate of transformation is going to be very slow, and probably not in our lifetime we will see the type of transformation that we want. On the political arena, yes, there's been much more peaceful democratic transitions on the continent, but at the same time, we've invented a new type of political leadership, which I like to call presidential monarchies, where we have elected presidents who are pushing their children to take over in Togo, in Gabon, potentially in Senegal and other countries. And it's as if, again, we see some good signs that in Zambia recently, but we also see concerning signs. Having said that, also what we found is that the progress that was made in the past 10, 15 years was by and large due also to what we call the Washington consensus: stabilize, liberalize, decentralize, and privatize. And we thought that by applying those norms uniformly, we would magically sort of transform the continent. Stabilize is about having balanced national budgets. But sometimes it goes at the cost of government investing in producing sectors for the economy. Liberalize is sometimes a cop-out when government decides not to get involved at all in critical leadership areas of the country, of the economy. Privatize, we thought we had a silver bullet, but we quickly learned that change of ownership doesn't necessarily mean better efficiencies in organizations. And then decentralize has made appear capacity issues when you're pushing key deliverables from government and other instances in rural areas where sometimes it seems to be blatant. So the idea to sort of apply blindly models that are, that may have worked in other places, but are not by any means uniformly applicable, is, we think, a shortcoming in the leadership we see. And we need to have much more acute, much more deliberate leadership in order to transform this continent. So what does that mean? We try to look at the way forward. And what the manifest is going to talk about when it comes out in October is we've sort of identified a group that's working on these 4 critical areas of leadership that we believe need to happen simultaneously in order to transform the continent. The first is about getting back to basics. We call it uplifting Africans. It's about refocusing on the purpose of it all, which is to increase the standard of living and the mode of living of the average African, period. And this is about moral purpose. This is about refocusing the leadership to service and really honoring and aspiring to transforming the lives of the majority of the people on the continent. We see that in the manifesto in sort of 2 areas which pertain to our human experience, the mind and the body. The mind, the first area around that is on rebranding Africa. It's first of all about branding ourselves, about believing in ourselves, and having both internally in our individual countries and collectively as a continent, respect for others and aspirations for the best for each other. Our countries are collectives or different groups. The myth that before the white man, before colonization happened, Africans used to get along together is absolutely a handicap for our development. The truth is that if you go to countries like Ivory Coast, in South Africa, all over the continent, Kenya, you had tribes 30 kilometers apart that didn't understand each other, who are forced to communicate in English, French, or Portuguese. That's the reality. It is not a handicap because America developed itself with a patchwork of people who came from all over the world. Italian Americans, Irish Americans, African Americans, Greek Americans. It's not a handicap, but it requires leadership to bring everyone together and to define a national identity that can bring us forward. The thing that this national identity is going to create itself, magically, is a serious lack of leadership that the manifesto is highlighting. Number 2, within each other. I come from Senegal. If you are a foreigner in Senegal, it's better to be French than Guinean. I live in South Africa. If you are a black foreigner in South Africa, it's better to be African American than Zimbabwean. The offenses and the prejudices that we have against our fellow Africans are offenses and prejudices against ourselves. We need to internalize that and confront it and change it, not deny it. Other areas of leadership, if I move to the way our leaders lead, we're asking for knowledge-based leadership. The world is a great village now. Information moves around. We need to, in every area of leadership, whether it's in government or private sector, honor knowledge, seek knowledge, invest in knowledge, and value knowledge. The democratic systems that we have are a plus, but sometimes they can be a handicap for effective leadership. Why? Because it takes forever to make decisions. We see it in the private sector. We see companies that are small, nimble, where decisions are made quickly, beating companies that have become corporate, obsolete, and slow. And this needs to apply to all parts of leadership if we are to move forward at the pace that we need to move forward. Capacity building, healthcare, housing, this is the body part of leadership. And what the manifesto is going to talk about is to give examples of countries that are driving those sectors very well, but primarily by bringing together the private sector and the public sector. That's the part on uplifting Africans. The second part is about creating and sharing African wealth. It starts with the definition of wealth. The Congo, Angola, Nigeria, Africa is endowed with natural resources. And yet, many of the countries that are endowed with natural resources have some of the lowest per capita income in the world. Why? Because wealth is not about natural resources. Wealth is with the ingenuity that people have to transform natural resources and to work together and find solutions for their problems. Governments doesn't create wealth. firms create wealth. And yet governments don't really focus on firms. Government budgets mostly come from aid or from the rents of natural resources that are accumulated by a few to the expense of the masses. If you take Nigeria's oil income, whatever it is, $300 billion a year, $400 billion a year, and you divide it by the 150 million Nigerians, it means that the wealth of Nigeria, of oil, if it was divided per head in Nigeria, would give you $20 to $30 per person. That's not wealth, even if it was equally shared. Wealth is about letting the ingenuity of entrepreneurs, firms prosper and develop themselves. So the manifesto will talk about that. It also starts with what we call industry clusters. Development, private sector development, is not about, as I mentioned, government, it's about firms. And those firms need to anchor themselves around key sectors. Tourism, tea, coffee, different sectors of the economy that pull the rest of the economy. But when government gets more of their income from aid or from the rest of mono-economies, mono-resources, they shun the private sector. They don't honor the private sector, and they don't drive private sector development really. And this is an area where the manifesto will talk about the commercial side of things, about how Africa can sell its coffee, its tea, its destinations, all the things that Africa has to offer the rest of the world that can really enrich Africans in a sort of more democratic way, because it's based on people who drive enterprises and transform the continent. Regional champions. Companies are already leading that effort. We see companies who are going across the continent, but who are still facing a lot of obstacles, even though they have a track record as they go to other African countries. Similarly, you see, if you look at Asia or Europe, the big companies of Europe who created the wealth of Europe started by having a sort of an open path almost within their own regions. In Africa, coming again to the mindset, sometimes we make things more difficult for our own companies to expand than we do it for non-African companies. So we need to change, no, it's fine. We need to change that mindset and really support what the manifesto calls the regional champions. And there are practical ways that this can be done that we'll be discussing in the manifest. And then entrepreneurship, I spoke about it before. Entrepreneurs are really the backbone of transformation on the continent. They are the unsung heroes of the continent, but they also face a lot of obstacles, not just financial, that need to be addressed. And the manifesto will speak about that. Investment climate, same thing. You see countries setting up, investment promotion agencies. You see people going 20 at a time to Europe, to Düsseldorf, to different parts of the world to invite investors. And yet, the domestic investors who save money to invest in their businesses have all the problems in the world to operate. They have all the problems in the world to start businesses even. The diaspora, people who want to come back, who have money, who want to come back home, are made things more difficult, and yet the government send people to countries where they don't even know on the map where is Maputo or where is Dakar, to come and invest in those countries. It comes also, it speaks to the mindset, and the manifest will speak about that in that particular chapter. The next piece that I want to sort of share with you is kind of a preview of the manifest, is what we call upgrading Africa's infrastructure. Infrastructure, we believe, is not the answer of all. Because, you see countries that do have infrastructure but are not necessarily prospering if this infrastructure is not linked to specific cluster sectors. But at the same time, we also need strong leadership in infrastructure. And it's possible. The manifest will talk about different countries that are doing it. Morocco, the electrification of Morocco, 18% electrification in '96, 100% in 2007. $2.5 billion later. Deliberate decision from the government to drive electrification, practical, pragmatic solutions, and in 11 years, that country reached 100% electrification. Those examples are really telling us, for us, the young generation of Africans, that it's possible. And the lessons are there. It's not magic, it can be done. Same thing for water, same thing for transport, and other parts of banking and financial services. The private sector and the public sector when they work together, can achieve really wonders, can really solve problems in a practical way without necessarily waiting for the World Bank or the IMF to come and give us cookie-cutter solutions. We need to learn, we need to be open, but we need to really have our own moral purpose to drive the development of the continent, and that's what the manifest is trying to express with different experts who contributed to it. And then last but not least, I understand that you guys want a little bit over time, so my presentation is not going to be too long. Last but not least, the last piece is about creating stable environments for growth. What does that mean? It means that before all those sort of initiatives and changes can take root, we need to secure the environments in which our countries operate. You see countries like the Ivory Coast, which was seen as a pearl of development in West Africa for many years. We're going back 50, 60 years in a matter of a few years of a conflict. We have intelligence services, we have police, we have gendarmerie, we have different services that are not serving the purpose of our countries. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure that in this room a lot of you are economists and business people, but don't discount the importance of security services, because without that, all the development that we make are compromised, because we have not yet mastered the way to sort of get different people to work together, the part of our leadership, you know, move away so I can get there. We need security services to play their role, and we need to educate ourselves on how to maintain the security services. Rwanda, I mentioned earlier, is a country that has really done very well in that, where you have a group of leaders who control completely the security services and are able to secure the development and protect the development of their countries. That's very, very important. Next, trade agreements, regional blocks, food security, these are all issues that have the potential of derailing our countries on the development path, and there's a lot of work that has been done, I'm looking at Jackie and others who are part of the Africa 2.0, that has been done to try and lay out what are the ways that those challenges can be addressed. So it's not going to be an easy process, but what we wanted to do as a collective, as I mentioned earlier, is to leave a legacy about the fact that those solutions to Africa exist. It's not rocket science. It requires strong, determined leadership, and a leadership that's open to ideas, that does the research and sees how can those problems be tackled. And it brings me to the last slide, which I wanted to share with you, which is basically a summary of the philosophy of the manifest, which is that countries have 7 forms of capital. 7 forms of capital. It's not just financial capital or human capital. We put at the bottom of capital natural endowments. The wealth that the country is born with. You know, it's at the bottom. Your oil, your diamond, your gold, it's at the bottom. Because it's not in itself wealth. Wealth is more in the ingenuity of people. The second basest form of capital is what we call man-made capital. Even that, your telephony, your network, your roads, a lot of leaders are jumping on that bandwagon, but it doesn't drive wealth necessarily unless it creates the type of organizations and industries that can create jobs and inject wealth in our countries. Third, financial capital. Again, big myth. If a country has money or financial capital, it will develop. No, the financial capital is the scoreboard. It's not the game. If you do well, you will have finances and you will have money. But it's not in and of itself a high form of capital. The highest form of capital are what we call the social form of capital above, and this is what transpires in the manifest as well. Institutional capital, how our institutions work. Knowledge capital, the patterns that we have, the ingenuity of our people, how is it captured? Can we transform our ingenuity into growing and stable businesses? The human capital, our training, our education, our health, and above all, cultural capital. I'm not talking about our fashion and our food and our music. I'm talking about our attitudes towards work, our attitudes towards leadership, our punctuality, our determination, our sense of sacrifice. That's what changes a country, that's what changes a continent. And I will leave you with this just thought, food for thought, which is that these notions are not new. These notions have transpired across history. You see it in the change of development, for example, between Southern Europe and Northern Europe in the 1500s. Spain, Italy, France were the powers of Europe in the 1500s. What happened when the church broke down, when the Protestant faith came up, along with it came an openness to, of the sacred to the common man. The Bible could be translated from Latin to English or Dutch. The Bible was to be made available to the common man. There was an openness of society. Alain Perfit writes about it, Francis Fukuyama writes about it in Trust, and many, many other authors have looked at that. And with this openness of the sacred came the sense of trust, of imparting capital, imparting trust and resources to people who have a demonstrated sense of enterprises, Christopher Columbus and others, and opening a meritocratic system to encourage people who have the ingenuity, who have the drive to accomplish great things. These people, I grant you, my brothers and sisters, now are the entrepreneurs of Africa. These are the ones who need to be imparted with that trust to change and move the continent forward. So, in the same way that the sense of development moved from Southern Europe to Northern Europe, in Africa we also need to change our mindset, our sense of leadership, and impart in the new generation that new vision, that new approach, that's driven, that's dedicated, and that's deliberate to push the continent forward. I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you the best for the next part of the